out to the White House, where Josh Earnest is briefing on this subject.
The ongoing Russian military activity inside of Syria. You'll recall that when President Obama and President Putin had the opportunity to meet just 2 days ago, both presidents agreed that it was a priority for both countries that tactical, practical conversations between our militaries take place to ensure that our military activities inside of Syria are properly deconflicted. That continues to be a priority. The U.S. military officials have been in touch with their Russian counterparts already to set up those discussions.
But Russia says they're going after ISIS. We see reports coming from the region that other groups are being struck, including Nusra and even a U.S.-backed rebel group, which would, at least the way you've described it in the past, mark a larger effort by Putin to try and simply go after extremists like the Islamic State, a mutual goal of ousting. So what do you make of the fact that it seems like they're bombing in areas that are not necessarily ISIS held and could be expanding this military operation to really try and shore up the Assad regime? Well,
the Department of Defense is going to take a look at the Russian military activities there, and it's too early for me to say exactly what targets they were aiming at and what targets were eventually hit.
I guess, do you take Putin at his word that he's only going after the Islamic State?
Well, the Department of Defense will take a look at the Russian military activities in Syria and may have more information to share about that in the days ahead. Your question, though, does raise, I think, something that warrants mentioning here at the outset, which is we are seeing the Russians ramp up their support for President Assad. They've been supporting him for quite some time, and it's clear that they've made a significant military investment now in further propping him up. The fact that Russia has to take these noteworthy steps to ramp up their support for Assad is an indication of how concerned they are about losing influence in the one client state that they have in the Middle East. And this is in contrast to, or at least calls into question their strategy, because when President Putin and President Obama had the opportunity to meet at the UN earlier this week, much of their discussion was focused on the need for a political transition inside of Syria. Now, there are well-known differences of opinion about what that transition looks like, but there was agreement on both parts about the need for a political solution to the problems that are plaguing Syria. That means Russia will not succeed in imposing a military solution on Syria any more than the United States was successful in imposing a military solution on Iraq a decade ago, and certainly no more than Russia was able to impose a military solution on Afghanistan 3 decades ago. So this goes to the case that the President made in his speech at the UN on Monday, which is that to confront these significant global challenges, nations around the world can exercise strength and exercise influence by being part of a large international effort to address those challenges. That's precisely what the United States is doing inside of Syria. The President is leading a coalition of now 65 countries that are implementing an integrated strategy that includes a robust military effort, but also includes efforts to try to counter ISIL's online radicalization efforts, shut down the flow of foreign fighters, engage in efforts to counter their financing efforts, and that is part of that is the most effective way for the United States to lead the international community. It's also the most effective way for us to advance U.S. interests in the region and around the world. It also is the most effective way for us to eventually arrive at the kind of solution to the significant problems that are plaguing that war-torn country.
In Afghanistan, amid new setback in Kunduz, military commanders from the U.S. are recommending that they'd like to see additional troops remain in Afghanistan beyond that small presence at the embassy that we've talked about in the past. Does the President agree with those recommendations, and is that something that he's actively considering?
Well, Josh, let me start by saying that the United States continues to monitor efforts by the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces to retake Kunduz. U.S. and coalition forces are providing advisory support and have conducted a limited number of airstrikes, primarily for the purposes of force protection. The United States will continue to work closely with President Ghani, the rest of the Afghan government, and our international partners to ensure that Afghan forces have the capabilities and training necessary to preserve the gains that have been made by the Afghans and the international community over the last 13 years. When it comes to policy decisions, I think I don't have a lot of news to make in this regard. But there are two observations that I have. The first is that the president, when announcing these decisions in the past, when it comes to our military commitment to Afghanistan, has routinely noted that the conditions on the ground influence that policy process. And so I would expect that that would continue, that would be the case in this circumstance as well. At the same time, we have always warned against the inclination to essentially make snap decisions on policy almost literally overnight. And so that's why we're going to continue to monitor the efforts by the Afghan government and Afghan security forces to retake Kunduz. And that will factor into a longer-term assessment of the conditions on the ground, which will influence longer-term policy decisions that the president will have to make.
Has the president received those recommendations from commanders in any kind of a formal way as of this time?
Well, I don't have any update for you in terms of the kind of communication between the commander-in-chief and the commanders on the ground. But as you know, Josh, the president does receive regular briefings and regular updates from his military commanders through the chain of command, and that certainly will continue.
And at the United Nations today, Palestinian President Abbas said he's no longer bound by agreements with Israel. They're going to start pursuing legal means to pursue Palestinian statehood and are basically abandoning the direct negotiations approach that has been your position for a very long time now. So what is the U.S. response to the Palestinians dismissing that approach?
Well, I believe that Prime Minister Abbas was speaking, or President Abbas was speaking right as I walked out here. So I don't have any direct response to what he has said. I will just say as a general matter that the United States has long been and continues today to be committed to achieving peace that the Palestinians and Israelis deserve. And we've described the resolution of this conflict as a two-state solution that results in two states for two peoples with a sovereign, viable, and independent Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with a Jewish and democratic Israel. That's been our position for quite some time, and that continues to be our position today. Okay. Julia.
Thanks, Josh. Going back to Russia's involvement in Syria, you just told Josh that the Defense Department is reviewing those actions. The Deputy Defense Secretary told lawmakers on the Hill today that Russia's move was alarming and aggressive and had come before discussions that they were promised to have on deconflicting. Is that same level of surprise being shared by the White House?
I didn't see those particular comments. I think what is clear is that we have known for quite some time, and when I say we, I'm including all of you, because we've had active public discussions in here about the significant deployment of military assets and personnel by the Russians into Syria. So I don't think it's particularly surprising that that Russia is using those new military capabilities, particularly in light of their long-standing efforts to prop up the Assad regime, and in light of the continuing weakness of the Assad regime in terms of their ability to control territory inside that country. The Russians felt that they need to ramp up their efforts. And the reason that I think the second data point that I would remind you of is that there's also a reason that both President Putin and President Obama have prioritized and agreed on the need for operational, tactical level conversations to deconflict military operations inside of Syria. You would need to have conversations to deconflict military activities inside of Syria if you didn't have plans for military operations inside of Syria. The point is that U.S. military officials have been in touch with their Russian counterparts to set up those conversations, and I would expect that those conversations would take place in short order.
So, yes, President Obama and President Putin discussed the need for conversations to deconflict, but during that hour-and-a-half conversation they had at the United Nations, did President Obama get any kind of indication from President Putin about the timing of these strikes or the targets, or was this something left completely off the table?
Well, I think what I would that there was not an operational level conversation in the meeting between the two presidents. Those operational conversations were the kinds of conversations that both presidents expect their military officials to engage in. And like I said, the United States has been in touch with Russian military officials to begin those tactical, practical level conversations to ensure that our military activities and Russian military activities are properly deconflicted.
Another question. On the Hill yesterday, lawmakers reached a compromise on the annual defense authorization bill, and they have it so that it would use $90 billion from special war funds to avoid sequestration. Mm-hmm. Would the White House oppose this bill on the grounds that it would end sequestration for defense but not other programs?
Well, I think that we would oppose the bill for the reasons that you have described. Because that's an irresponsible way to fund our national defense priorities. Even Republicans in Congress have referred to this as a slush fund. So this is not a partisan response. In fact, we know that this is actually a view that is shared by by some Republicans on Capitol Hill. I'd also point to you, direct you to the statement that was released by the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Jack Reed, a West Point graduate from Rhode Island. According to his news release, he said, quote, "There are many needed reforms in the committee conference report, but the use of emergency war funds does not realistically provide for the long-term support of our forces." Senator Reed continued saying, "I cannot sign this conference report because it fails to responsibly fix the sequester and provide our troops with the support that they deserve." The position that's articulated by Senator Reed is the position that that President Obama has advocated as well. That's why if the president got this this bill, he'd veto it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's move around. Justin.
Just a quick one on Russia. Based on your language, is it fair to say that the U.S. wasn't given or didn't have any of these deconflicting conversations or conversations about coordination before the airstrikes began?
It is fair to say that U.S. officials had already been in touch with their Russian counterparts to set up those meetings. But it is accurate to say that those deconfliction conversations have not yet occurred, but I would expect that they will begin in short order.
And when those conversations start, is it merely going to be Russia or the U.S. saying, we plan to act in this area, so keep your military interests out and safe? Or will there be any sort of coordination of efforts between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, I think it's hard to prejudge at this point exactly what those conversations look like, other than that they will abide by the description that I have used here for a couple of weeks now, that these will be tactical, practical level conversations. We have long said that we would welcome constructive Russian contributions to our counter-ISIL campaign. So I certainly wouldn't rule out any coordination. We would welcome Russian coordination, but the purpose of the conversations is to ensure that our military activities and the military activities of our coalition partners are effectively and safely deconflicted from any military operations that the Russians may be planning.